The Sogdian traders, often forgotten by time, were the masterminds who wove the fabric of the ancient global economy. From the dusty, sun-scorched desert of Central Asia to the opulent palaces of Rome, Persia, and China, their caravans carried more than just spices, silk, and gold. They carried cultures, ideas, and innovations that would change the course of history. Yet behind their wealth and influence, the Sogdians remained shrouded in mystery. Who were these traders, whose very existence seemed to straddle the line between myth and reality? For centuries, they thrived at the crossroads of East and West, not only as merchants, but as diplomats, warriors, and visionaries. Their influence spanned empires, bridging the worlds of the Roman Empire and the Chinese Tang dynasty, and even infiltrating the far reaches of India, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula. As the Silk Road flourished, the Sogdian people cemented their place as the critical cog in the wheel of ancient trade, pulling vast swathes of the known world into a shared network of commerce and communication. But this prosperity did not come without a price. The Sogdians' role as the guardians of the Silk Road was never secure. Just as they were building vast fortunes and cultural connections, the winds of change began to blow across Central Asia. The Mongols, a fearsome and unstoppable force, would soon set their sights on the lands that had long been the domain of the Sogdians. With their arrival came devastation, not just of cities, but of the very trade networks that had connected civilizations. In the end, the Sogdians, once the unrivaled masters of the Silk Road, would be eclipsed by the very forces they had helped shape. Yet their story, one of immense ambition, incredible cultural exchange, and tragic decline, remains etched into the annals of history. Today we uncover the legacy of the Sogdian traders, a people who built bridges between the East and the West and whose rise and fall echoes through the ages. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the story of the Sogdian traders, a tale of ambition, power, and the rise and fall of the people who once ruled the Silk Road. We'll explore their origins, the cultural crossroads they created, their dominance as merchants and diplomats, and the dramatic forces that brought about their downfall. Along the way, we'll dive into their remarkable achievements in trade, art, and culture, and witness their dramatic clash with the Mongol Empire that would change everything. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new video. And if you're not subscribed yet, please let us know why in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Central Asia, vast and enigmatic, unfolds like a land untouched by time, a region where the earth itself speaks in extremes. The great expanse is a study in contrasts, from the blistering heat of the Kyzylkum and Karakum deserts, stretching out in endless shifting sands, to the towering peaks of the Tian Shan and Pamir mountain ranges, crowned with snow year-round, defying the heat below. At first glance, it seems inhospitable, an arid expanse where the ground is scorched and vegetation is sparse. But this is a land that rewards the patient, the resilient, the strategic. Here, in the barren deserts and the barren foothills of the mountains, the Sogdians would forge their legacy, not just as merchants, but as survivors and adapters. The very land that seemed to resist civilization became the stage upon which they would build their empire of trade. The Kyzylkum Desert, with its golden sands, that stretch endlessly under a relentless sun might seem to be a realm of solitude. The harsh winds here carry not only the searing heat, but also the weight of time. The Sogdians, with their intimate knowledge of these desert expanses, became masters of survival. The vastness of the desert, unforgiving as it was, shaped them in ways that go beyond mere endurance. It taught them to read the landscape, where to find water, how to predict the movements of sand dunes, and when to rest. Their caravans, laden with goods from the east and west, crisscrossed this terrain, creating pathways that would eventually stitch together the fabrics of entire civilizations. Yet, it was not just about surviving the harsh environment, it was about mastering it. The Sogdians became more than desert dwellers. They were the architects of trade routes that spanned continents. The desert was both a challenge and an opportunity. As much as it threatened, it also provided a natural barrier, one that controlled the flow of goods, ideas, and culture between the mighty empires of China, India, Persia, and Rome. But to view Central Asia as a desert alone would be to miss the heart of the land, the oasis cities that rose like jewels from the dry soil. As the great rivers of Central Asia, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, carved their paths through the land, they brought life to the otherwise arid plains. These rivers, nourished by the towering glaciers of the Pamir Mountains, fed the lush valleys where Sogdian agriculture would flourish. In the fertile banks of these rivers, cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva grew, each an urban hub of commerce, knowledge, and culture. The Sogdians, whose survival had been shaped by the harsh deserts, now found themselves in possession of some of the most fertile land in all of Central Asia. It was here, in these valleys, where they perfected the art of irrigation, channeling water from the rivers to irrigate vast fields of crops, wheat, barley, and cotton, staples that fed not just their people, but the many caravans that passed through their lands. Vineyards spread across the hillsides, fruit trees blossomed in abundance, and the scent of fresh produce filled the air. This was not just a land of survival, it was a land of prosperity, a testament to the adaptability of the Sogdians who thrived in the harshest of climates and then blossomed in the nurturing soil of the riverbanks. Here, the Sogdian people would come to live as farmers and traders, blending the nomadic skills of their ancestors with the settled agricultural practices of their new environment. It was this fusion of adaptability and innovation that allowed them to build a bridge between the East and the West. The rivers of Central Asia were more than just a source of sustenance. They were the veins that carried the lifeblood of the Sogdian trade networks. The rivers, though treacherous at times, also offered vital transport routes. Along these waterways, the Sogdians would launch their caravans, laden with goods that connected disparate parts of the known world. Silk, spices, precious metals, and exotic treasures made their way from the cities of China to Persia, and from there to the farthest reaches of Rome. These rivers became the arteries of the ancient Silk Road, linking empires, cultures, and peoples in a web of trade and diplomacy. And yet these same rivers that provided wealth and prosperity also demanded respect. The Sogdians, born from the desert and nurtured by the rivers, became experts in navigation, both of the land and the water. They understood the seasonal floods, the shifts in water levels, and how to safely guide their caravans through the fertile valleys and beyond. rivers, like the desert, became a natural ally in their empire of trade, providing the infrastructure that allowed them to thrive and connect with distant lands. Central Asia's geography, with its extremes of desert and river, harsh mountain peaks, and fertile valleys, did more than shape the Sogdians. It formed their identity. From the desert, they drew the harsh lessons of survival, learning to travel light, to navigate hostile environments, and to survive in the face of overwhelming adversity. From the river valleys, they drew the lessons of settlement, agriculture, and the prosperity that comes from mastery over the land. Together, these experiences fused to create a people who were equally at home in the harshness of the desert as they were in the flourishing riverbanks. The land itself demanded that the Sogdians be both traders and warriors, wanderers and settlers. They mastered the nomadic lifestyle in the deserts, but as they settled near the rivers, they became the greatest merchants the world had ever known. Their empire of trade, built on the foundation of Central Asia's diverse geography, would come to span thousands of miles, connecting the greatest empires of the ancient world. The desert taught them resilience, while the rivers gave them the wealth and strength to build an empire that spanned continents. The early Sogdians, before they became the renowned traders of the Silk Road, were a people defined by the vast, unforgiving steppe, a land where survival demanded agility and wisdom. These nomads were not solitary wanderers, but part of a larger tapestry of tribes that had learned to adapt to the harsh environments of Central Asia. Their life was one of constant motion, driven by the ebb and flow of the seasons, the migration of herds, and the endless quest for trade opportunities. In the beginning, the Sogdians were not merchants or farmers. They were primarily herders, traversing the immense distances of the Central Asian steppes. Their lives revolved around their livestock, camels, horses, and sheep. The Sogdians' intimate knowledge of the land and their finely tuned survival instincts allowed them to thrive in environments that might have seemed inhospitable to others. It was in these wide expanses, between the heat of the Kizilkum Desert and the cool heights of the Tian Shan Mountains, where they first came into contact with their neighboring civilizations. While these early Sogdians had their own distinct identity, they were not isolated from the larger world. Central Asia has always been a crossroads of cultures, and the Sogdians, like many nomadic tribes, were keenly aware of the valuable goods flowing through their land. Persian caravans, Indian traders, and Chinese envoys passed through the region, each bringing with them different goods, ideas, and technologies. The Sogdians, with their keen adaptability, found themselves in an advantageous position. They were able to not only facilitate trade between East and West, but to learn from the very cultures they encountered. However, their relationship with these more settled civilizations was often one of wary coexistence. The Sogdians were seen by the empires around them as both valuable allies and potential threats, as nomads often were in history. The Sogdians' transition from nomadic life to settled existence was not a sudden change, but rather a slow and gradual evolution, one marked by necessity and opportunity. The fertile river valleys, particularly along the Zerv Shan River, became a critical factor in this shift. Here, the harsh desert winds gave way to the nourishing flow of water, and the soil, watered by the mountain-fed rivers, proved fertile for agriculture. As the Sogdians began to settle in these valleys, they faced a new set of challenges. The rhythms of nomadic life, where movement was key to survival, had to be replaced with the rhythms of agriculture, which demanded patience, careful cultivation, and the ability to manage permanent settlements. Yet the transition was not simply about growing crops, it was about the slow integration of farming and trade and the resulting rise of early Sogdian towns. The Zerv-Shun River, a vital waterway flowing from the Tin-Shun Mountains, became the lifeblood of these settlements. It was along these banks that early Sogdian villages began to emerge. Archaeological evidence uncovered in these regions, such as ancient farming tools, pottery, and even early irrigation channels, speaks to the ingenuity and adaptability of the Sogdians. They learned to harness the water that came from the mountains, using it to irrigate fields of wheat, barley, and fruit trees. The rich valley soils allowed the Sogdians to thrive in ways that would have been impossible in the harsh desert. As the Sogdians settled and began to farm the land, they also began to develop early forms of commerce. At first, these settlements were small, humble affairs, but their location near the river and their strategic positioning along key trade routes meant they were destined for growth. The early Sogdian settlements, like Samarkand and Bukhara, were not yet the grand cities of legend, but they were rapidly becoming centers of trade and culture. Archaeological discoveries, such as the ruins of early Sogdian buildings and marketplaces, show a thriving community where goods from China, Persia, and India were exchanged. These cities became the first true testaments to the Sogdians' potential as traders. The Sogdians, while still largely a farming society, began to build the infrastructure that would support long-distance trade. They developed a network of roads and caravansaries where merchants could rest and replenish. The bustling markets became gathering places for a diverse array of people: Persian merchants selling silk, Indian traders offering spices, and Chinese craftsmen peddling their fine porcelain. It was here, in these marketplaces, that the Sogdians' unique ability to bridge the gap between East and West began to take shape. The early Sogdian settlements also became places of cultural exchange as the Sogdians began to interact with their neighbors, whether Persian, Indian, or Chinese. They were not just trading goods, but ideas, religious ideas, particularly Buddhism, began to take root in Sogdian society. Indian Buddhist monks passed through the region, spreading their teachings to a receptive audience in the Sogdian cities. The Sogdians were among the first to carry Buddhism westward, and their role as intermediaries helped spread this new religion to China. This cultural exchange would go on to shape the future of Central Asia for centuries to come. The Sogdians' ability to adapt and integrate these various influences into their own society was remarkable. They were not passive recipients of foreign culture, but active participants in its transmission. This adaptability became a defining feature of the Sogdian character as they grew into the great merchants of the Silk Road. They not only traded in material goods, but also became carriers of knowledge, art, and religion, connecting distant civilizations through their vast network of trade. Despite the opportunities the river valleys presented, the Sogdians' transition from nomadic life to settled agriculture was not without its difficulties. They had to adapt their social and political structures to accommodate a more permanent way of life. The demands of managing farms, protecting settlements, and organizing trade routes were new challenges for a people who had once been focused on the rhythms of movement. Yet, in overcoming these challenges, the Sogdians built the foundation for their future success. In time, the very adaptability that had served them well as nomads would serve them just as well in their role as merchants and diplomats. The Sogdians became experts in navigating the complex web of trade routes that stretched from the Roman Empire in the west to China in the east. They had learned to live both in the desert and by the rivers, drawing from the best of both worlds to create a civilization that was both resilient and prosperous. Central Asia, a sprawling land of contrasts and extremes, is not merely a geographic location. It is a defining feature in the rise of one of history's most influential trade networks. At the crossroads of East and West, this vast expanse of deserts, mountains, and river valleys offered not just a strategic location, but an unparalleled opportunity for those who understood its complexities. Central Asia was the gateway to the world, and the Sogdians, born from the harshest of environments, became the stewards of this gateway, capitalizing on its geography in ways that few others could. Imagine a vast land where the extremes of nature collide, a place where the desert's scorching heat meets the icy grasp of towering mountains. Central Asia, the cradle of the Sogdian people, is shaped by a geography that is as unforgiving as it is majestic. To the north, the Altai and Tian Shan mountains rise abruptly from the plains, their snow-capped peaks standing as natural fortresses. To the south, the sprawling deserts of the Kizilkum and Karakum stretch endlessly, their scorching sands swallowing everything in their path. Between these extremes lies a narrow corridor of fertile land nourished by the rivers that flow down from the mountains, creating oases of life in an otherwise harsh landscape. This was the environment the Sogdians were born into, a land where survival demanded more than mere existence. It demanded resilience, innovation, and the ability to navigate an unforgiving world. Yet within this harsh terrain lay the very foundation of their success. For the Sogdians, geography was not merely an obstacle, but an opportunity, a vast and complex landscape that, with the right knowledge and strategy, could be turned into the world's most lucrative trading corridor. The Silk Road, the network of routes connecting China, India, Persia, and the Roman Empire, passed directly through this strategic region, making Central Asia a crossroads of commerce and culture. At the heart of this vast trading web lay the Sogdian region, an area positioned perfectly to serve as a hub for goods, ideas, and technologies. The Sogdians were not simply passers-by on these trade routes. They were the architects of the Silk Road itself, expertly navigating the complex geography of Central Asia to build a thriving network of trade that spanned thousands of miles. The Silk Road was a mosaic of ancient paths and dangerous roads where goods were carried over incredible distances. From the precious silks of China, gold and glass from Persia, to the fine wines and spices of India, the flow of trade through Central Asia was vital to the prosperity of empires. The Sogdians found themselves at the epicenter of this exchange, acting as the vital link between the East and West. They were intermediaries, yes, but their role was far more dynamic. They were the catalysts who ensured that goods, knowledge, and culture traveled smoothly across vast distances. The routes of the Silk Road were not easy paths. They were fraught with natural obstacles, from the blistering heat of the desert to the jagged heights of the mountains. The Sogdians had to develop unparalleled expertise in navigating this treacherous geography, traversing deserts like the Kizilkum and Karakum meant enduring days of heat and dust, while crossing the Tian Shan and Pamir mountains posed the threat of avalanches, narrow passes, and freezing temperatures. The Sogdians, however, were masters of the land. They understood the delicate balance of the terrain, the seasonal winds that could change the face of the desert, the treacherous mountain passes that only the bravest could cross, and the river routes that connected distant empires. Their caravans, often consisting of hundreds of camels, were the lifeblood of this trade network. These caravans carried not just goods, but the very essence of civilization: ideas, inventions, religions, and philosophies. To move across this vast expanse required more than just physical endurance. It required a deep understanding of the landscape. The Sogdians mapped the terrain in ways others could not, marking hidden springs in the desert, identifying safe mountain passes, and creating rest stops along the way. Their skill in navigating these regions made them indispensable to the flow of trade, ensuring that goods moved efficiently and safely across vast stretches of the ancient world. While the geography of Central Asia provided the physical infrastructure for trade, it was the Sogdians' skill in diplomacy and commerce that transformed it into the beating heart of the Silk Road. Positioned between the great empires of China, Persia, and Rome, the Sogdians were uniquely placed to act as intermediaries. They were not just merchants, they were cultural brokers, diplomats, and agents of exchange. The Sogdians had the rare ability to engage with each of these civilizations in their own language, linguistically, culturally, and politically. For China, the Sogdians were the essential link to the West. They brought with them not only goods, but also the stories and ideas of the outside world, shaping Chinese art, technology, and philosophy. For the Persians, the Sogdians were a critical point of access to the Eastern world, supplying them with goods that were beyond their reach. And for the Romans, The Sogdians were the trusted middlemen who ensured that the finest silk, glass, and spices flowed westward, helping to fuel the Roman Empire's insatiable appetite for luxury goods. It was in this role as cultural and economic brokers that the Sogdians truly shone. They understood the needs of each empire and adapted their trading practices accordingly. They brought the riches of the East to the West and the wealth of the West to the East, ensuring that trade was not just profitable, but sustainable. By bridging the gap between these great empires, the Sogdians became essential players in the development of world history. As the Sogdians mastered the art of trade, they also became agents of intellectual and cultural exchange. They carried not only physical goods, but also the seeds of knowledge, from Buddhist teachings that spread from India to China to the early concepts of papermaking that would revolutionize the world. The Sogdians were the conduits through which new ideas, technologies, and religions traveled, leaving a lasting impact on the cultures they touched. Central Asia, with its geography of extremes, was not just the stage for the Sogdians' rise, it was the defining force that shaped them. From the desert's harshness to the river valley's fertility, from the rugged mountains to the vast plains, the land demanded more than simple survival. It demanded adaptability, ingenuity, and vision. The Sogdians, through their mastery of this environment, transformed it into a thriving empire of commerce and culture, ensuring that their legacy would endure long after the fall of the Silk Road itself. The story of the Sogdian merchants is one of adaptation, resilience, and sheer strategic brilliance. The rise of these remarkable individuals as intermediaries between the East and West did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, shaped by the convergence of geography, culture, and opportunity. Central Asia, with its vast deserts, towering mountains, and fertile river valleys, was both a natural barrier and a gateway. The Sogdians were uniquely positioned at the crossroads of several great civilizations: China, Persia, India, and Rome. This land of extremes, where the relentless desert met the nourishing rivers, became the heart of the Silk Road, and the Sogdians were its heartbeat. To truly appreciate the Sogdians' success, we must first understand the geography that made them indispensable to the flow of trade. Central Asia, while harsh and unforgiving, was an area of immense strategic value. Situated between the great empires of China and Rome, with Persia lying to the southwest, the Sogdian region served as a vital crossroads, not just of goods, but of ideas, technologies, and cultures. This was not just the meeting point of empires, it was the bridge that connected the most powerful civilizations in the world. The Sogdians, who had long been nomadic herders and traders, capitalized on their geographical location. The Silk Road, the legendary trade network that stretched from China to the Mediterranean, passed directly through their territory. The trade routes that snaked through the deserts and mountains of Central Asia were no easy path. They were fraught with challenges, from the unforgiving terrain to the political complexities of moving goods across multiple empires with their own customs, laws, and rivalries. Yet the Sogdians were not only able to navigate these challenges, they mastered them, becoming the go betweens who facilitated the exchange of goods and knowledge across continents. What made the Sogdian merchants so successful in this vast and competitive landscape? At the core of their rise was their adaptability, both to the physical environment and the political landscape. Their nomadic roots had given them the ability to move swiftly across the steppes, navigating the challenges of the desert with precision. But as they settled along the river valleys, particularly near Samarkand and Bukhara, they turned their nomadic expertise into a sophisticated network of trade routes. The Sogdians became masters of long distance trade, skilled in the logistics of moving goods, people, and ideas across vast distances. Crucially, the Sogdians were linguistically gifted. As the middlemen between East and West, they had to communicate across a vast array of cultures. Fluent in Chinese, Persian, Greek, and other languages, they were able to navigate the complex political and commercial landscapes of multiple empires. Their linguistic skills were not just practical, they were political assets, allowing them to broker deals, negotiate terms, and mediate conflicts between empires. The Sogdians became diplomats in their own right, serving as trusted intermediaries who helped to maintain the delicate balance of power between the great civilizations. In addition to linguistic fluency, the Sogdians possessed a deep cultural understanding that made them invaluable to the empires they traded with. Whether negotiating with the Chinese emperor, striking deals with Persian nobles, or navigating the political intrigue of Roman merchants, the Sogdians understood the nuances of each empire's customs, desires, and politics. This cultural fluency allowed them to act not just as traders, but as trusted emissaries, diplomats, and negotiators. Their ability to understand and adapt to the cultural and political needs of their clients made them the most effective and sought after merchants on the Silk Road. The goods traded by the Sogdians were as diverse as the empires they served. The Sogdians were primarily known for their silk trade. Silk, a luxury commodity, was in high demand from the Roman Empire, where the elite would pay astronomical sums for this fine fabric. The Sogdians served as the key conduit for Chinese silk to reach the West, acting as the link between the emperor in China and the aristocracy in Rome. But silk was just the beginning. In addition to silk, the Sogdians transported spices, precious metals, glassware, jewelry, and textiles. These goods not only enriched the Sogdians, but also fueled the economies of the empires they worked with. The Persian Empire, rich in spices and precious metals, relied on the Sogdians to bring luxury goods from India and China. In return, the Sogdians brought Persian luxury goods back to the east. The Sogdians were middlemen in the truest sense, taking what one empire had in abundance and passing it along to another in exchange for goods that were equally prized. However, the Sogdians did not simply transport material wealth, they also carried ideas and knowledge. The spread of Buddhism from India to China was largely facilitated by Sogdian merchants who not only moved goods but also religious texts and teachings. The Sogdians were instrumental in bringing Buddhist ideas to China, where they were received and eventually shaped into a distinct form of Chinese Buddhism. The Sogdians also transported the technology of papermaking, a Chinese innovation that would eventually spread throughout the Islamic world and much later to Europe, revolutionizing communication and education across continents. While the Sogdian merchant class as a whole was instrumental in the success of the Silk Road, there were individuals and families whose names became synonymous with wealth, power, and influence. One such figure was the merchant Nani, a well-known diplomat who played a pivotal role in facilitating trade between the Sogdians and the Chinese Empire. His skill in navigating the complex political landscape of the Tang dynasty allowed him to secure favorable trade deals and establish Sogdian merchants as key players in the Chinese court. Another influential figure was the Sogdian trading family of the Nasi, who became famous for their extensive trade networks connecting Persia, India, and China. The Nasi family's involvement in diplomacy and trade extended beyond mere economic dealings. They were involved in the cultural exchange that defined the Silk Road. Their family archives, preserved in Sogdian inscriptions, reveal how they negotiated with Chinese officials, facilitated the spread of Buddhist texts, and amassed great wealth through their trading acumen. These figures were not just merchants, they were cultural ambassadors, representing the interests of their people and shaping the economic and political landscapes of multiple empires. The Sogdians' unique position as middlemen between East and West allowed them to shape not only trade, but also the cultural and intellectual exchanges that defined the Silk Road. They were not passive participants in the global economy. They were active agents of change, using their position to influence everything from religion to technology. Their trade routes carried not just physical goods, but ideas, philosophies, and innovations that would forever alter the course of history. In the end, the Sogdians' legacy is one of adaptability, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They were the unseen architects of a global system of trade, one that connected civilizations across vast distances and forged a new world order. Without the Sogdians, the Silk Road might have been nothing more than a collection of disconnected routes. But with them, it became the artery through which the world's greatest civilizations could exchange not just goods, but ideas, cultures, and knowledge. The Sogdian merchants did not simply carry goods across the deserts and mountains of Central Asia. They were the master diplomats of their time, wielding language as both a shield and a sword. Their profound understanding of multiple languages did more than connect markets across continents. It allowed them to navigate the complexities of empire building, political intrigue, and cultural exchange. It was through their linguistic skills that the Sogdians became more than just intermediaries. They became the essential architects of the Silk Road's cultural and political exchanges. The Sogdians were multilingual in a world where linguistic barriers were often insurmountable. In the vast and fragmented network of the Silk Road, language could be the deciding factor in whether trade flourished or faltered. The Sogdians understood this better than anyone. Fluent in Persian, Chinese, Greek, and Bactrian, among other languages, the Sogdians were perfectly poised to act as go-betweens for the great empires of the East and West. Their linguistic fluency did more than facilitate trade. It gave them a unique ability to mediate disputes, broker deals, and even shape the policies of the most powerful empires in the world. Unlike other groups that might have been limited to a single language, the Sogdians could converse with a wide range of empires, from the bureaucratic sophistication of the Chinese to the sophisticated merchants of Persia, and even the military elites of Rome. This made the Sogdians not just crucial participants in commerce, but essential figures in the political landscape of the ancient world. They were the living link between civilizations that might never have interacted without their presence. The Sogdians' role as diplomats cannot be overstated. They were key figures in the negotiations and treaties that shaped the flow of goods, people, and ideas between empires. Their involvement in China's diplomatic missions is perhaps one of the most striking examples of their influence. The Tang dynasty, during its reign, faced both internal strife and external threats. As the empire sought to secure its borders and ensure the free passage of trade along the Silk Road, it turned to the Sogdians for assistance. In 627 CE, during the reign of Emperor Taizong, a Sogdian merchant named Nani played a critical role in a diplomatic mission between the Tang dynasty and the Persian Empire. Nani, whose family had deep ties to both Chinese and Persian courts, was tasked with negotiating the safe passage of caravans through Central Asia, which was increasingly fraught with danger due to the ongoing military tensions between the Tang dynasty and the Karakhanid Khanate. Through his diplomatic acumen and mastery of multiple languages, Nani was able to broker a peace agreement that not only secured the trade routes, but also opened up channels for cultural exchange between the two empires. This instance of Sogdian diplomacy highlights not only their commercial importance, but also their ability to influence international politics. Similarly, The Sogdian merchants played a crucial role in the Byzantine Persian interactions during the early 7th century, when the two empires were at loggerheads. Sogdian diplomats, leveraging their linguistic and cultural skills, were able to facilitate trade agreements and negotiate ceasefire that allowed merchants to continue their work, preserving the flow of goods through some of the most volatile regions of the Silk Road, while the Sogdians' oral linguistic skills made them invaluable as diplomats and traders. Their written language played an equally important role in the maintenance of trade records, contracts, and cultural exchanges. The Sogdian script, which evolved from Aramaic, became the language of commerce along the Silk Road. Sogdian merchants were responsible for drafting contracts that recorded trade agreements and secured both legal and financial transactions. The widespread use of Sogdian language in trade records meant that they not only facilitated the movement of physical goods, but also allowed for the seamless exchange of knowledge. The Sogdians' role in preserving and translating Buddhist texts from India into Chinese is an example of how their language bridged more than just political or economic gaps. It facilitated the spread of ideas by translating sacred religious texts and adapting them to local languages. The Sogdians helped carry Buddhism to China, where it would eventually take root and shape the religious landscape for centuries to come. Moreover, the Sogdian language played an essential role in preserving the historical narrative of the Silk Road. Through their written records, the Sogdians documented not only commercial transactions, but also interactions with neighboring empires, cultural influence, and the shifting political dynamics of the time. These documents have proven to be invaluable resources for historians seeking to understand the complexity of the ancient trade routes and the role of intermediaries in fostering a global economy. In addition to the general influence the Sogdians had as traders, they were directly involved in key diplomatic events that marked turning points in the history of the Silk Road. One of the most notable examples was their role in the Treaty of Tang and Uyghur, 7th century, where Sogdian merchants acted as the primary intermediaries between the Chinese emperor and the Uyghur Khanate. The Sogdians helped negotiate the terms of the trade routes that would ensure the safe passage of caravans through Central Asia, and their involvement in these negotiations was crucial to maintaining the flow of goods between China, Persia, and the Byzantine Empire. Similarly, the Sogdian merchants were involved in the diplomatic missions between Persia and India, facilitating the exchange of luxury goods and securing long-term trading relationships. These diplomats ensured that trade didn't just happen sporadically, but in a manner that was regulated and sustained, ensuring the continuous exchange of not just material wealth, but cultural and technological knowledge across continents. The Sogdians were not merely traders. They were the architects of an international network that united the distant corners of the ancient world. Through their linguistic mastery and diplomatic finesse, they built bridges between empires, enabling the flow of not only goods but also ideas, religion, and culture. The Sogdians' ability to speak multiple languages allowed them to mediate political relationships and create alliances that benefited the empires they worked with. They were the silent, invisible force behind the grand exchange that was the Silk Road, shaping international diplomacy and global trade in ways that still echo in the world today. The Sogdians' legacy is a testament to the power of language and culture in connecting humanity. Their contributions to the spread of Buddhism, the transmission of technological innovations, and the facilitation of diplomatic relations across vast empires secured their place as one of the most important, yet often overlooked, players in world history. In the heart of Central Asia, where the vast deserts meet towering mountains and rivers snake their way through lush valleys, there arose a civilization that became the crucible for one of the most remarkable cultural exchanges the world had ever known. Sogdiana, the ancient land of the Sogdians, was more than a crossroads for goods. It was a melting pot of ideas, a place where the ancient East and West came together, blending traditions, philosophies, and artistic expressions into a society that was uniquely cosmopolitan, dynamic, and forward looking. The cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, famous for their wealth and strategic importance along the Silk Road, were not merely bustling trading hubs. They were the intellectual and artistic heartbeats of the Sogdian world. These cities became centers where scholars, artists, and religious figures from distant empires mingled, exchanged ideas, and created a new cultural tapestry. It was here that the Persian, Greek, and Indian influences fused, shaping a cultural renaissance that would leave a lasting imprint on the ancient world. At the height of Sogdian power, Samarkand was more than just a city. It was a beacon of culture and knowledge that attracted the greatest thinkers, artists, and traders from across Asia and Europe. The city's grand bazaars were alive with the chatter of merchants. But beyond the market stalls, it was a hub of learning, home to a number of libraries, universities, and philosophical schools. These institutions were not merely places of study. They were places where the greatest minds of the East and West met, exchanged ideas, and influenced one another. Samarkand, as the capital, was not only a place of economic exchange, but a city of intellectual synergy. Here, Greek philosophers shared their thoughts on ethics and logic, while Indian mathematicians discussed the science of astronomy and numerical systems. Persian scholars brought their knowledge of Zoroastrianism and natural philosophy, while Buddhist monks spread their teachings of karma and meditation. The Sogdians, acting as intermediaries, did more than trade goods. They became the translators and preservers of this vast intellectual heritage, ensuring that knowledge from one empire could flow freely into another. Bukhara, though smaller in comparison, was no less vibrant. It became a center for religious diversity and intellectual pursuit. Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, and Buddhists lived side by side, their beliefs often influencing one another. Bukhara's scholars helped preserve the manuscripts of Greek philosophers, while also translating and preserving Indian astronomical texts. The religious tolerance that defined the Sogdian cities allowed these different traditions to coexist and thrive, enriching the intellectual and cultural fabric of Sogdiana. What set Sogdian culture apart was its ability to absorb and synthesize diverse influences into something uniquely their own. The Sogdians did not merely adopt foreign traditions, they transformed them, creating a new, hybridized aesthetic that blended the artistic, architectural, and philosophical traditions of Persia, Greece, and India. This synthesis is perhaps most evident in their art, architecture, and religious iconography. The Persian influence was the most evident in the grandeur of Sogdian architecture. The Sogdians built their temples, markets, and palaces in the grand Persian style, with minaret columns, grand archways, and intricately detailed mosaics. Yet, in these buildings, the Sogdians incorporated distinctly local motifs, blending the Persian style with Sogdian symbolism, a fusion of grandeur and intimacy that became their hallmark. At the same time, the Greek influence, introduced during the conquests of Alexander the Great, left a lasting imprint on Sogdian art. Greek pottery, sculpture, and portraiture became highly prized in Sogdian cities. The Sogdians took these classical Greek forms and reinterpreted them, incorporating their own local sensibilities. The result was a unique Sogdian style of portraiture that depicted both Persian kings and Greek philosophers with a strikingly realistic yet distinctly Central Asian flair. The Indian influence, particularly the spread of Buddhism, was perhaps the most transformative. Sogdian artisans adopted Indian religious iconography, depicting Buddha and bodhisattvas in sculptures and paintings. These images, while heavily influenced by Indian models, were adapted to reflect Sogdian styles. Soft lines, vibrant colors, and local motifs were incorporated, creating a fusion of artistic traditions that was both fresh and profound. This blend of Persian, Greek, and Indian elements created a distinctive Sogdian aesthetic that was rich, dynamic, and cosmopolitan. It was an art that spoke of the exchange of ideas, the fusion of cultures, and the creativity that emerged from the crossroads of the world. But the cultural flourishing of Sogdiana was not limited to art and architecture. It extended into the realms of philosophy, science, and religion. The Sogdians were critical in preserving and transmitting the intellectual traditions of the great empire they engaged with. They were not just passive recipients of foreign knowledge, they were active participants in the transmission of ideas across the Silk Road. The Sogdians helped preserve Greek philosophical texts, ensuring that the works of Plato, Aristotle, and others reached the Persian and Arab worlds. These works were later translated into Arabic, forming the foundation of Islamic philosophy. Similarly, the Sogdians translated Indian mathematical texts, preserving the advanced mathematical knowledge that would later reach the Islamic world and from there, Europe. The Sogdian role in the transmission of knowledge was not only about preserving ancient wisdom, but also about adaptation and integration, ensuring that ideas from one culture could be interpreted and applied in new contexts. The religious contributions of the Sogdians were equally significant. As Buddhist missionaries and Zoroastrian priests, they played a central role in spreading the teachings of Buddhism from India to China. Their role in facilitating the Buddhist mission is a testament to their religious tolerance, a core value that allowed them to engage with and adapt multiple belief systems. The Sogdians' ability to act as both religious translators and cultural mediators made them a unique force in the spread of ideas along the Silk Road. The cultural legacy of the Sogdians is a testament to their creativity, their intellectual rigor, and their unparalleled ability to synthesize the best ideas from the East and West. Through their art, philosophy, and religion, the Sogdians created a society that was truly cosmopolitan, a vibrant tapestry of cultures, ideas, and traditions that continues to inspire scholars and artists today. The cities of Samarkand and Bukhara were not merely economic hubs, they were cultural crucibles, where East met West, and where the intellectual, artistic, and religious traditions of the ancient world converged. The Sogdians were the unseen architects of this cultural exchange, shaping the ancient world in ways that are still felt in the modern era. The sun cast its warm golden rays over the bustling markets of Samarkand, a city renowned for its scholarly elegance, stunning architecture, and the rhythmic pulse of merchants trading across the Silk Road. Bukhara, too, stood as a proud testament to the flourishing cultural heart of Central Asia. Here, the Sogdian merchants moved freely, dealing in spices, silks, and ideas, crafting a world where trade was not just an economic endeavor, but a way of life, one that connected the distant civilizations of the East and the West. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, the ground trembled with an impending storm. In the cold steppes of Mongolia, a force was stirring, a force that would soon sweep across the lands of the Sogdians and leave nothing but ruin and despair in its wake. The rise of the Mongol Empire was swift and ruthless, heralding the end of an era for the ancient world. The merchants, philosophers, and artisans of the Silk Road, who had long relied on the relative peace and stability of their trade routes, found themselves staring into the abyss. The Mongols, led by the visionary Genghis Khan, were a people whose ferocity and military genius had been underestimated by many. For centuries, the Mongols had been viewed as little more than a collection of scattered nomadic tribes roaming the vast plains of Central Asia. Yet under Genghis Khan's leadership, they began to unite, transforming into a force of nature that would shatter the conventional boundaries of the known world. By 1206, Genghis Khan had successfully unified the Mongol tribes, and the conquests began. From the steppes to Persia, and soon into the heart of the Silk Road, the Mongols expanded with terrifying speed. Their armies were not just vast, they were lightning fast and highly strategic. The Mongols relied on mobile cavalry, exceptional archers, and psychological tactics that demoralized their enemies before battle even began. Unlike the Persian and Chinese armies, who employed long sieges and static defenses, the Mongols struck swiftly, often attacking before their enemies had time to react. As the Mongol Empire grew, the Silk Road, which had for centuries been a path of trade and cultural exchange, suddenly became a target. The Sogdian cities, home to the wealthiest merchants and the most prestigious intellectuals in Central Asia, became prime targets. Once, they had served as the crossroads of global commerce, but now they were in the direct path of the Mongol war machine. Samarkand, Bukhara, and other prominent Sogdian cities became increasingly vulnerable to the Mongol threat, and the once thriving trade routes began to feel the first tremors of fear. The early signs of Mongol aggression were subtle yet unsettling. Reports began trickling in from merchants who had been traveling along the northern routes. Tales of burning villages, the sudden appearance of Mongol cavalry, and the destruction of entire caravans. But it wasn't until 1220, when the Mongols set their sights directly on the great city of Bukhara, that the Sogdians realized their world was on the verge of collapse. Bukhara had long been a symbol of cultural and intellectual achievement. It was a city of learning, where scholars gathered to study Greek philosophy, Indian astronomy, and Persian literature. Bukhara's markets, once bustling with the finest silks, spices, and artifacts from across the known world, now stood on the brink of destruction. The Mongols besieged the city with relentless force, and within weeks, the once glorious city was reduced to ruins. To the Sogdian merchants who had spent their lives on the Silk Road, this was no mere military conquest. It was a cultural massacre. The city's libraries, filled with priceless manuscripts and knowledge from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions, were destroyed. The intellectual elite of Bukhara, who had once welcomed scholars and diplomats from around the world, were now trapped in a deadly siege that would ultimately mark the end of an era for Sogdian culture. The fall of Bukhara was a wake-up call for the Sogdians. Samarkand, the jewel of their cities, felt the tremors of impending disaster. It was no longer a matter of if the Mongols would come, it was a matter of when. The Sogdian merchants, once so accustomed to navigating the political intrigues of great empires, now faced an enemy that cared nothing for diplomacy, treaties, or negotiations. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were harbingers of total destruction. In the face of this new threat, the Sogdians found themselves scrambling. The great fortifications of Samarkand, which had once been a symbol of their strength, were now seen as insufficient against the Mongol siege tactics. The city, like others across Central Asia, had been built with impressive walls designed to withstand traditional sieges, but the Mongols didn't operate in conventional ways. Instead, they used a combination of psychological warfare, speed, and relentless force to weaken their enemies before ever engaging in direct combat. Sogdian merchants, long accustomed to bartering and negotiating, now found their world turned upside down. The wealth that had flowed through the Silk Road seemed meaningless in the face of a threat that threatened to erase entire civilizations from the map. What had once been a bustling, vibrant world of trade now felt like a world on the brink of collapse. The Mongols' military strategies were in stark contrast to the established empires that had ruled over Central Asia for centuries. Persian, Chinese, and even Roman armies had relied on siege warfare, heavy infantry, and fortified cities to maintain control. The Mongols, however, were not bound by these traditional constraints. Their forces were highly mobile, relying on speed and precision rather than strength alone. The Mongol cavalry, armed with long-range bows and superior tactics, could strike quickly and retreat before the enemy could respond. They would target key cities and swiftly overwhelm them with overwhelming force. If a city resisted, the Mongols would not simply attack. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Entire populations were forced to submit or face utter destruction. Unlike the empires that had previously ruled over the region, the Mongols did not engage in prolonged battles. They hit hard, leaving a trail of terror that ensured others would fall in line without a fight. The fear and uncertainty they sowed as they moved across Central Asia were just as powerful as their weapons. The Sogdians, unprepared for this new form of warfare, found themselves at a disadvantage they could not have predicted. As the Mongols advanced, the Silk Road, which had been the backbone of Sogdian prosperity, began to unravel. The city of Samarkand, once a beacon of art, commerce, and learning, now faced an uncertain future. The threat was not just military, it was existential. The cultural heart of the Sogdians was at risk of being silenced forever. The Mongol invasion was not simply an attack on a region, it was the collapse of the very foundation upon which the Sogdians had built their identity. As the shadow of the Mongol Empire spread across Central Asia, the Sogdians found themselves in a race against time. Would they adapt quickly enough to survive this new threat, or would their cities their cultures, and their way of life be swallowed by the unstoppable force of the Mongols. The calm before the storm had ended, and the great Sogdian world was about to be forever altered. The skies above Samarkand, once a brilliant blue canvas reflecting the wealth and prosperity of the Sogdian heartland, were beginning to darken. It was the calm before the storm. The winds of change, like distant whispers, began to echo through the markets, the scholarly halls, and the grand palaces of the city. In the distance, the Mongol Empire, under the rule of Genghis Khan, was rising with brutal speed and unstoppable might. The Sogdians, who had long thrived in their cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, began to realize that the world they had known was about to be irrevocably torn apart. In the early 13th century, the Mongols were a force few had reckoned with. Once a collection of disparate tribes scattered across the frigid steppes of Mongolia, they were now united under the unparalleled leadership of Genghis Khan. His rise to power was rapid, and his army's advance was a thunderous declaration of their military superiority. The Mongols, feared for their speed, decisive tactics, and psychological warfare, began their unstoppable conquest across Central Asia. Unlike the traditional siege tactics of the Persians, the Chinese, or the Turks, the Mongols employed new methods that shattered conventional defense strategies. They were not just conquerors, they were destroyers. They employed fast-moving cavalry, archers who could shoot arrows with precision even while riding at full gallop, and siege engines that could tear down the mightiest walls. Their psychological warfare was as important as their physical strength. News of the Mongol brutality spread like wildfire ahead of their armies, forcing cities to surrender without a fight, if only to save their lives. The first sign of what was to come was the destruction of Bukhara, but the fall of Samarkand was an even more profound blow to the Sogdians. Once the proud capital of their empire and a city of intellectual, artistic, and economic brilliance, Samarkand became the crown jewel of the Mongol conquest. By 1220, Genghis Khan had turned his gaze toward this glittering city, knowing that to truly claim dominance over the Silk Road, Samarkand must fall. The Mongols laid siege to Samarkand with brutal efficiency. They surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and communication, and began bombarding the city's walls with their siege weapons. But the Mongols didn't just use force, they used fear. The news of their devastation in Bukhara had already sown terror in the hearts of Samarkand's defenders. Despite the formidable walls and gates of Samarkand, the Mongols were able to breach them using siege engines, huge catapults, and trebuchets capable of hurling massive stones into the heart of the city. Once inside, the Mongols unleashed their full fury. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets, while merchants, intellectuals, and leaders were either executed or enslaved. The city's glorious libraries, filled with priceless knowledge from Persian, Greek, and Indian sources, were set aflame. The intellectual capital of the Silk Road, painstakingly built by Sogdian scholars, was erased in a single, relentless sweep. As the dust settled, what remained of Samarkand was little more than ruins and the screams of those who survived. The Silk Road, which had once thrived under the Sogdian stewardship, was now under Mongol control. The very heart of the trade routes lay shattered, a tragic symbol of a once great civilization brought to its knees. With the Sogdian cities crumbling, the Silk Road itself faltered. For centuries, the Sogdians had been the brokers of commerce between China, Persia, and Rome. The merchants who had once thrived, carrying silks, spices, and knowledge across continents, now found themselves isolated and vulnerable. The Mongols, though they would eventually open trade routes to the west, did so on their terms, leaving behind a broken world of ruined cities, displaced peoples, and shattered networks. The Sogdian traders, those who had not been captured or killed, now had to face a grim reality. The once thriving trade routes that passed through Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv were now dangerous and unpredictable. Even those who survived were left without the means to conduct business or rebuild their networks. With the Mongol Empire now controlling vast swaths of land, Sogdian merchants had to navigate new political boundaries and face restrictions that were foreign to them. In the aftermath of the invasion, the Sogdian people were left to piece together their lives in a world that had been irrevocably changed. Among the survivors were those like Yusuf, a once wealthy merchant whose silk business had spanned from Samarkand to China. When the Mongols invaded, he found himself fleeing with his family through the barren desert, the wealth he had built over decades reduced to dust. Yusuf's story was not unique. Many of the merchant families faced the same heartbreaking reality. Their houses looted, their goods stolen, and their lives forever altered by the Mongol assault. Some survivors, like Rashid, a Bukhara noble, managed to escape and seek refuge in neighboring regions. Yet, despite his survival, Rashid was haunted by the loss of his city, his family, and his heritage. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, unable to find the peace he once knew. Bukhara, like Samarkand, was reduced to ashes. A city that had once stood as the heart of learning and commerce was now a symbol of destruction. The Mongol conquest of the Sogdian cities was more than just the fall of a people. It was the end of an era. The Silk Road, which had once hummed with the exchange of goods, culture, and ideas, now lay ruined, its lifeblood drained. The Sogdian, who had once thrived at the crossroads of civilization, were scattered, silenced, or absorbed into the Mongol Empire. The cultural and intellectual contributions of the Sogdians, who had long been the connective tissue between East and West, were lost in the flames of war. The fall of Samarkand, Bukhara, and the entire Sogdian world is a tragic reminder of how quickly civilization can fall when confronted with overwhelming force. The Mongols' brutality and efficiency left little behind but broken cities, displaced people, and the loss of an entire cultural legacy that had once bridged the gap between East and West. The devastation wrought by the Mongol invasion was felt far beyond the blood-soaked battlefields and the rubble of ruined cities. It wasn't just the Sogdian cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv that were destroyed. It was the very soul of a civilization. For centuries, the Sogdians had been the cultural and economic heart of the Silk Road, a bridge connecting the East and West. Their lives woven into a rich tapestry of trade, intellect, and cultural exchange. But when the Mongol armies arrived, the loom of their existence was torn apart, and the world they had known, the powerful merchant class, the bustling markets, the vibrant scholarship, was shattered in the blink of an eye. The human cost of this war was more than just the lives lost in battle or the cities destroyed. It was the psychological and emotional toll of displacement, humiliation, and survival in the face of annihilation. The once proud Sogdian traders, who had controlled vast networks of wealth, found themselves reduced to refugees and beggars, their identities fractured by the sheer violence of the Mongol conquest. The collapse of trade not only crippled the economy, it erased the very social fabric of Sogdian society, leaving in its wake a profound void. The personal stories from this period offer a sobering glimpse into the emotional toll of the Mongol onslaught. Amid the chaos, letters were written, often desperate, often full of pleading and sorrow, as families tried to stay connected, as merchants sought refuge, and as leaders made their final attempts at preserving the remnants of their world. One such letter, found in the ruins of Samarkand, was written by a wealthy merchant named Shahin, whose family had lived in the city for generations. My brother, I fear this may be the last letter I ever write. The city is burning, and the Mongols are sweeping through. Our wealth means nothing now. The Mongols have no mercy. I see families fleeing, but where can they go? Our trade routes are cut off, and our homes are destroyed. If you can, leave and find safety. But there is nowhere safe anymore. I am not sure how much longer I can stay. I fear it is already too late. Sheehan's letter speaks not just of fear, but of a desperate realization. The world he knew was crumbling, and his wealth, once a source of immense power, had no value against the ferocity of the Mongol invasion. The merchant class, which had thrived through centuries of trade and negotiation, was suddenly powerless against the tide of Mongol conquest. Sheehan, once a man of influence, now faced the same fate as those he had once ruled over. In another poignant account, Layla, a widow from Bukhara, writes to her daughter as she tries to make sense of the destruction around her. My dear child, I can no longer find the strength to write as I once did. Your father is gone, taken by the Mongols. The house is silent, no longer filled with the laughter of traders and scholars. Our family was once known across the Silk Road, but now we are shadows. I do not know what to do. We cannot return to our former lives, for the Mongols have burned everything to the ground. I will find a way, though. For you, we must survive. Layla's letter, though filled with grief, is also a reflection of the resilience that so many Sogdians had to adopt in the face of unimaginable loss. Survival in this new world meant letting go of everything that had once defined them, their wealth, their status, and their community. But survival also meant something else. It meant losing hope, the loss of Bukhara, a city that had once been the intellectual and spiritual center of the Sogdian world, symbolized the collapse of Sogdian identity. For the Sogdian merchant class, the collapse of the trade networks was both economic and existential. The Silk Road, which had once been a dynamic and thriving conduit for commerce, was now a broken and fragmented path. Cities that had thrived on the constant exchange of luxuries, knowledge, and cultural goods now lay in ruins, their marketplaces silent and their merchants scattered across the land. The wealth and power that the Sogdian merchants once held were rendered meaningless in the face of Mongol destruction. Shahin, like many others, saw his fortune vanish in a matter of weeks. The loss of trade meant the loss of not only money, but social standing. These merchants, once the rulers of a vast commercial empire, were now reduced to nothing more than wanderers, trying to scrape together enough food to survive. As the Sogdian economy collapsed, so did the social order. The merchant class, which had been the backbone of Sogdian society, was decimated. The intellectual elite, who had once engaged in the preservation and transmission of knowledge, were now silenced, their libraries burned, and their work erased. In the absence of trade, the Sogdian family structures that had once supported their wealth began to disintegrate. Without their wealth and status, traditional roles were upended, and the social cohesion that had once held Sogdian cities together was now gone. The human cost of the Mongol invasion was not just in the physical destruction, but in the psychological trauma that lingered long after the Mongols had passed through. For those who survived, the mental and emotional toll was immense. Families who had once been united by wealth and status were now fractured with no clear way to rebuild their lives. For many, the loss of identity was the hardest blow to endure. Layla, as a widow, could no longer cling to the familiar rhythms of her former life. The material wealth of her family had vanished, and so had the security that wealth provided. Survival meant constantly adjusting to a new reality, one that offered no guarantees and no path back to what once was. The Mongol invasion left behind more than just ruins. It left an entire people questioning their place in the world. The Sogdians, who had once been the center of the Silk Road, now found themselves on the margins, struggling to redefine their identities in a world that had been violently altered. The emotional and psychological toll of such an upheaval would echo for generations, leaving a people who had once been great reduced to mere survivors, haunted by the ghosts of a civilization they could no longer claim as their own. The Mongol invasions were not just military conquests, they were the destruction of a way of life. The Sogdians, once at the crossroads of the ancient world, were now forced to reckon with the reality of a world that had changed irrevocably. Their cities, once vibrant with the hum of trade and culture, were now silent. The Silk Road, the lifeblood of their civilization, had been shattered. The Sogdian merchants, once the pillars of their society, were left with nothing. The human cost of this destruction was immense. The lives of the Sogdian traders and their families were forever altered, their identities erased by the relentless tide of Mongol conquest. What remained was a civilization in ruin, but also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Those who survived, though broken and scattered, still carried the memory of a world that had once been theirs. The Mongol storm that had swept through Sogdiana, leaving its once glorious cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv in ruins, was not just an event, it was a seismic shift that would echo through the ages. What had once been a network of thriving trade routes where merchants exchanged not just goods, but ideas, culture, and knowledge, was now a broken, fragmented system. The Silk Road, which had been the beating heart of commerce between East and West, lay in tatters, its lifeblood drained by the Mongol conquest. The Sogdians, whose merchant networks had once spanned the vast reaches of the known world, now found themselves scattered, lost and shattered, their cities, their wealth, their influence gone. And yet, in the ruins of their civilization, a new order began to emerge, one that would change the landscape of Central Asia forever. Before the Mongols arrived, Sogdiana was a land of unrivaled wealth and intellectual brilliance. Samarkand, often referred to as the Pearl of the East, was a center of learning, a place where scholars studied the great texts of Greek, Persian, and Indian thought. Bukhara was home to merchants who controlled the trade of silk, spices, precious metals, and jewels. The Sogdian merchants were among the richest and most powerful individuals in the world, the unsung rulers of the Silk Road who facilitated the exchange of not just material wealth, but ideas, religions, and cultures. But when the Mongols arrived, they brought with them an end to this golden age. The siege of Samarkand was swift and brutal. The city, that had once been a bustling hub of intellectual and commercial activity was reduced to rubble. The markets were silent, the libraries destroyed, and the palaces burned. The Sogdian merchant class, who had been the backbone of the economy, was shattered, their once great fortunes lost. Merchants who had once been able to trade goods freely across empires now found themselves with no markets to supply, no goods to exchange, and no allies to turn to. Once the Mongols had consolidated their power in Central Asia, they began to reshape the Silk Road in a way that was both innovative and deeply transformative. The trade routes that had once been managed by Sogdian merchants now fell under the Mongols' direct control, while the Sogdians had relied on a decentralized system of merchant networks that spanned the length of the known world. The Mongols centralized the trade routes, ensuring that all goods and ideas moved under their supervision. The Mongols created a vast empire, stretching from the Chinese steppes to the gates of Europe, and with this newfound dominance came a centralized control over the Silk Road. The Sogdian merchant class, once the key players in this trade, was displaced by Mongol officials who oversaw every aspect of trade. The Mongols built new trade posts and fortresses to protect their trade routes. But the freedom and fluidity that had characterized the old Silk Road was replaced with a rigid structure that served the empire's interests. Goods still moved along these routes, silk, spices, precious metals, but the Mongols ensured that these movements aligned with their imperial needs. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, took control of the Yuan dynasty in China and opened the East to trade with Europe like never before. The Mongols also created safe corridors for traders, but they were fenced in, forced to operate within the confines of Mongol authority. While Sogdian merchants had once controlled the flow of goods, the Mongols now controlled it. The wealth that had once flooded into the hands of Samarkand's merchants and Bukhara's traders was now funneled directly into the Mongol Empire's coffers. The Mongol Pax, or Mongol peace, did ensure that trade would continue, but the empires of the past were replaced by Mongol monopolies that altered the very nature of the Silk Road. As the Mongol Empire consolidated its power over Central Asia, new powers began to emerge from the ashes of the old world. The Ilkhanate, which ruled over Persia, and the Golden Horde, which expanded into the steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe, inherited the legacy of the Mongol conquests, but began to carve out their own identities. These new empires, though once part of the larger Mongol imperial framework, would grow into independent entities in their own right. In Persia, the Mongol destruction of Bukhara and Samarkand led to the rise of new Persian dynasties, such as the Safavids and Timurids, who later sought to revive and rebuild the intellectual and cultural exchanges that had once flourished along the Silk Road. Timur, in particular, known as Tamerlane, sought to restore some of the glory of Samarkand even as he imposed his own brutality on the region. He, like the Mongols, recognized the importance of Central Asia as a hub of trade, art, and culture, and he sought to harness these forces for his empire's benefit. In the West, the Golden Horde left behind a lasting impact on Russia. The Mongol conquest of Kievan Rus set the stage for the rise of Moscow as the dominant power in Russia. Though the Mongols ruled with an iron fist, they also left behind an administrative legacy that influenced Russian governance for centuries. The Mongols brought Islam to the region, which would later influence the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the spread of Islamic culture across Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The aftermath of the Mongol conquest was not just about the rise of new empires, it was about the end of the old order. The Sogdians, once the masters of the Silk Road, were now ghosts in the ruins of their cities. The collapse of the Sogdian merchant class left a cultural and economic vacuum that would take centuries to fill. The new Silk Road under Mongol rule was a vastly different beast, centralized, controlled, and carefully monitored. Yet in the destruction of Sogdiana and the rise of Mongol power, a new world had been forged. The Mongol reshaped Central Asia and redefined how trade and ideas would flow through the region. They might have destroyed the old Silk Road, but they paved the way for the development of a new far-reaching empire that would influence the course of world history for generations. The Mongol conquest had shattered the Sogdian world, leaving the great cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv in ruins. The once thriving merchant class that had linked the East and West was decimated, and the Silk Road, the heart of Sogdian commerce and culture, lay fragmented. Yet, despite the brutal destruction, the Sogdian legacy did not vanish. It endured, quietly, subtly, woven into the fabric of the Timurid Empire, the Mongol rule, and the broader Central Asian cultural revival. Though the Sogdians were no longer at the forefront of history, their language, art, and economic practices persisted, leaving an indelible mark on the civilizations that followed. Timurid Samarkand, where the echoes of the Sogdian past still resonated, became the seat of a new empire, one that both acknowledged and reinterpreted the achievements of the Sogdians. While the Sogdian language was no longer spoken by the masses, its influence persisted in Central Asia for centuries. The Sogdian script, once the lingua franca of the Silk Road, continued to resonate in the written traditions of the region as Persian, Turkic, and Uzbek languages evolved. The Sogdian vocabulary subtly embedded itself in these languages, particularly in trade terminology and administrative terms. The Sogdian language was also preserved in religious texts. Manichaean and Buddhist manuscripts in Sogdian script were passed down through generations, often recopied by Persian and Central Asian scribes who sought to preserve these ancient traditions. The Mongols, who themselves adopted some aspects of Sogdian culture, helped facilitate the survival of these written records, enabling later scholars to access the knowledge of the Sogdian past. As the Timurids rose to power in the late 14th century. Their scholars revisited the intellectual achievements of the Sogdians. Samarkand, once a vibrant hub of Sogdian commerce, became the intellectual center of the Timurid Empire, drawing scholars from across the Islamic world. Here, the influence of Sogdian linguistic traditions helped shape the intellectual discourse of the time, even as the Mongol rulers integrated Persian and Turkic influences into their own administrative systems. The artistic legacy of the Sogdians lived on through the Timurid Empire, particularly in the fields of architecture, painting, and textiles. Timur, fascinated by the splendor of Samarkand's past, sought to revive its former glory by commissioning magnificent architectural projects that echoed the Sogdian aesthetic. The tilework of Registan Square, with its vibrant colors and intricate geometric patterns, is a striking example of the continuation of Sogdian design principles. The Sogdian frescoes, which depicted everyday life alongside mythological themes, inspired Timurid miniatures and the design of royal palaces. The Timurid use of color and symbolism, particularly the use of blue and gold, bore a striking resemblance to the Sogdian murals and the decorative arts that flourished before the Mongol conquest. Additionally, the Sogdian textile traditions, particularly the weaving of luxurious silks with intricate patterns, persisted in the Timurid courts. While the Sogdian merchants no longer dominated trade, their craftsmanship lived on through the Timurid royal patronage of silk weaving. The patterns and motifs that once adorned Sogdian fabrics found their way into the timeless textiles created for the Timurid elite. This cultural revival through art marked the resilience of the Sogdian aesthetic. Although the Sogdian merchant class had been scattered by the Mongol invasion, the economic systems they had built continued to influence the Mongol Empire and the Timurid trade networks. The Sogdians' mastery of international trade, their ability to move goods across vast distances, and their knowledge of banking systems were not easily forgotten. The Mongols, recognizing the importance of trade to their empire's stability, relied on the systems the Sogdians had developed. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road was reopened, but it was reorganized into a centralized system. While the Sogdian merchants were no longer in charge, their legacy in facilitating the smooth flow of goods across Eurasia influenced the Mongol administrative systems. The Mongols' centralized control of trade, particularly under Kublai Khan, reflected the efficiency and organization that had characterized the Sogdian trade routes. Moreover, the Sogdian banking systems, in which merchants offered credit, kept ledgers, and facilitated the exchange of goods, were preserved in the Mongol and Timurid empires. The Mongols utilized Sogdian methods of record keeping and commerce, adapting them to the needs of their growing empire. Despite the Mongol conquest, Sogdian traditions continued to influence later Central Asian empires. Under the Timurids, the revival of Sogdian cultural practices became evident in both intellectual and artistic spheres. The Timurid rulers of Samarkand, seeking to restore the glory of the past, became patrons of the arts, reviving the Sogdian aesthetic in architecture and literature. The legacy of Sogdian knowledge also endured in the studies of astronomy, medicine, and philosophy in Timurid Samarkand. The intellectual exchange that the Sogdians had facilitated for centuries between Persia, China, and India continued under Mongol and Timurid rule, blending ancient traditions with new innovations. The city of Samarkand, with its scholarship, became a symbol of continuity, a place where Sogdian intellectual achievements and the cultural wealth of Central Asia converged. The Sogdian influence did not simply disappear with the fall of their cities. It endured in the trade systems, arts, religious traditions, and intellectual pursuits of later empires. The Mongols and Timurids may have reshaped the Silk Road, but the cultural foundations laid by the Sogdians continued to thrive in the very empires that had once sought to destroy them. The Sogdians may have fallen from power, but their legacy, like the threads of silk they once wove, remained entwined in the fabric of Central Asian history, a testament to their enduring impact on the cultures that rose from the ashes of their empire. When the Mongols descended upon Sogdiana, the great cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv crumbled under their ruthless assault. The Sogdian merchant class, which had once bridged the vast expanse between the east and west, was scattered, exiled, or exterminated. Yet, despite the physical destruction, the Sogdian legacy did not disappear. It endured, silent but persistent, woven into the very fabric of the civilizations that followed. The Sogdians may have fallen, but the economic systems, the cultural exchange, and the diplomatic networks they established would continue to shape the world for centuries. The Sogdian traders were far more than mere merchants. They were the architects of the first truly global network of commerce, culture, and diplomacy, spanning from the gates of China to the shores of Rome. They linked distant worlds through the exchange of goods, ideas, and practices. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for the interconnectedness of civilizations that has endured to this day. In this final reflection, we explore how the Sogdians shaped not only the world of their time, but also the course of history in ways that continue to reverberate across continents. The Silk Road, the ancient network of trade routes that crossed Asia, was more than just a path for goods. It was a connector of civilizations, and at the heart of this global exchange were the Sogdian traders. From China to the Mediterranean, the Sogdians were the gatekeepers of commerce, facilitating the movement of silk, spices, gold, and ideas. They were the first to truly globalize trade, creating a network that transcended the reach of any single empire. The Sogdian merchants were experts in diplomacy. Their ability to speak multiple languages, Sogdian, Persian, Chinese, Greek allowed them to engage with a multitude of cultures and broker peace between warring empires. The Silk Road, under Sogdian influence, was more than a mere commercial venture. It was a diplomatic network that connected China, Persia, Rome, and India. In this way, the Sogdians were not only traders, but ambassadors of peace. Their cross cultural negotiation ensured that, despite the vast distances between civilizations, goods and knowledge could flow freely. One poignant example of the Sogdians' role in diplomacy comes from the Tang dynasty in China. As Chinese emperors sought to expand their influence along the Silk Road, Sogdian merchants facilitated trade agreements with Persia and India, ensuring the prosperity of China's central empire. The Sogdian merchants were the linchpins of this complex system, and their influence was felt not just in the goods they moved, but in the relationships they helped forge between vast and disparate empires. While commerce was the backbone of Sogdian power, it was cultural exchange that set them apart. The Sogdian cities were vibrant melting pots of Persian, Greek, Indian, and Chinese influences, and it was this fusion of cultures that made Sogdian art, architecture, and intellectualism so unique. In Samarkand and Bukhara, scholars gathered to study Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian poetry, creating a cultural milieu that was unparalleled in the ancient world. Even after the Mongol invasions, the Timurids, who sought to revive the grandeur of Samarkand, drew heavily from Sogdian traditions. Timur himself, seeking to restore his empire's cultural prestige, looked back to the Sogdian past, commissioning artworks and architectural designs that reflected the fusion of Greek, Persian, and Central Asian styles. The tilework, frescoes, and mosaics created during the Timurid period echoed the intricate designs and vibrant colors of the Sogdian artistic tradition. The Mughal Empire, which followed the Timurid dynasty, continued this tradition, especially in the textile industry. The famous Mughal silks, often patterned with intricate floral motifs, were a direct continuation of the Sogdian weaving tradition. This cultural inheritance ensured that, even in the face of collapse, Sogdian artistic influence was passed down through the ages. The Sogdian economic system was a model for later empires, including the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, after their conquest, recognized the importance of trade and swiftly adapted the Sogdian model of centralized commerce. The caravanserais, the roadside inns that had once served Sogdian merchants, were revived and expanded under Mongol rule, providing safe havens for merchants traveling the Silk Road.